Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that. Josh and I had supper together tonight, and it's always interesting when you get to associate with someone for the very first time and you start running the rabbit trails. Invariably, you start running across people you know and have in common, and that didn't take long to do tonight. And so somebody said one time, it's a small world, and the truth of the matter is, no, it's a big family. When you're Christians, it's a real big family. And I'm glad to be with your family this week and to join with all of you and worship together. And we have a lot of visitors tonight. Thank each of you for coming and being a part of our assembly. We really appreciate that so very much. The Holman family from Little Rock, I'm just glad to reconnect with you guys again and see y'all. And we've been together a couple of times, and so I'm really glad to see them again. And the Ball family here, and we kind of go back to Tennessee a little bit there, so I'm glad they're able to be with us. And this young couple right up here on the front drove all the way down here from Newport, and it's Randy's birthday, so happy birthday. Sacrificed your birthday to come hear me, I guess, huh? Big deal. We go way back to the early 1980s. When we lived in the Washington, D.C. area, and Randy and Peggy Williams were just great friends, and Peggy's father was one of the elders there, and he and her mother were just such a delight to us and the dearest of friends, and they've moved off to Arkansas now, and so I don't see them very often, so they've surprised me tonight, and I am just absolutely thrilled about that. Every time I see them post on Facebook about a wedding anniversary, I always remember I was there, because I performed the ceremony. I was there. You know, I ought to mail that license in sometime. I've been seeing y'all. I remember I forgot to do something. So, but I'm so glad they're here. And if you haven't met Randy and Peggy Williams, please do that before the service is over tonight. Other visitors, wherever you're from, near or far, thank you for coming and encouraging all of us here at the congregation in Cabot. That just means so much to everyone who is here. Open your Bible, if you will, to 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1. Where Paul says, "Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God." Some translations render that, "Let us perfect holiness out of reverence for God." You say, what does that have to do with marriage? Everything. We'll come back there in just a minute. Greg walks to his car, hits the button on the keypad to unlock the door. Nothing happened. He hit it again. Nothing happened. The door locks wouldn't work. So he was able to take the key and manually get in the vehicle the old-fashioned way. But when he did, the car wouldn't start. And the gas gauge read empty, even though he had just filled it up that morning. In fact, he got to noticing nothing in the car was working. He had to have the vehicle towed to the dealership, and the mechanic comes back finally with a diagnosis and tells him, "Greg, you've got a bad BCM. Stands for the Basic Control Module. It's kind of the brain of your car. If it goes bad, then nothing's going to work in the car." Now, Greg could have insisted, "No, I want you to fix the door locks. I want you to fix this remote control. I want you to fix my gas gauge. I want you to fix all of the individual things that are not working." But Greg was smart enough to know that all of those were just symptoms of a much bigger problem. When it comes to marriage, I wonder sometimes how often we focus on the symptoms instead of the basic control module. Here's a young couple and they come in and they say, we need to work on improving communication with one another. Okay, but that's a symptom. Another couple says, we need to get better at handling conflict resolution. Okay, but that's a symptom. Another couple says, we need to show more appreciation for one another. We need to show more affection for one another. Okay, but that's a symptom. And we can spend all of our time focusing on the symptoms, or we can focus on the basic control module. And the basic control module for the Christian is a spiritual focus. It is a spiritual motivation. It is 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1. Perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. I don't know what you think that means, but I'll tell you what I think that means. I think that means God comes first. So here's my question. Would marriage be included in that? Or would marriage be excluded from that? You see, it all comes down to this. You're either going to be a God-centered spouse, or you're going to be a self-centered spouse, a spouse-centered spouse. One of the two. A spouse-centered spouse will act nice toward her husband as long as he acts nice toward her. A spouse-centered spouse will go out of his way for his wife as long as she remains agreeable and affectionate. Does it ever occur to us that God demands more from us? And Paul talks about it here in verse 1 of chapter 7. Perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. The number one motivating factor in all that we do, including this very special, albeit brief, earthly relationship called marriage, the number one motivating factor in everything we do should be reverence for God. I am not called to love and serve my wife because she's holier than anybody else. It's not it. I am not called to love and serve my wife because she always makes me happy. I am not called to love and serve my wife because things between us every day of the week and every day of the year is always just wonderfully ooey and gooey. I'm not called to love and serve my wife for that reason. I am called to love and serve my wife out of reverence for God, period. Let us perfect holiness, holy living, righteous living, out of a respect for, reverence for God. All of which means every decision I make, every behavior I have, every attitude I manifest flows from this singular, holy motivation. Is this something that brings honor to God? So back to my question. In your marriage, do you just treat the symptoms? Or do you work on the basic control module? There's all kinds of quotations about marriage. I'm going to give you my all-time favorite. It's by a guy, you may have heard of him, Socrates. I want you to listen carefully to this great statement on marriage. Socrates says, by all means get married. If you get a good wife, you'll be happy. If you get a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher. Socrates. There you go. You ever stop and think why God didn't design this marriage thing to be easier than it is? I mean, it sounds easy. When you're on the outside looking in, it looks easy. My wife went to a wedding not long ago, and she said, I'm standing there in the receiving line, and I finally get up to Lisa, and I give her a hug, and Lisa gives me a hug, and she says, "Oh, Miss Julie," she said, "I'm so thankful the hard part's over." And my wife took her head in her hands and said, "Dear one, are you in there? The hard part hasn't started yet." You ever watch a Hallmark movie? If you're a fan of the Hallmark Channel, I don't want to blow it for you, so if you want to go ahead and cover your ears, that's fine. This is a spoiler alert. The Hallmark movies are all the same, every one of them. There's a beautiful couple that meets under improbable conditions. They fall in love. They fall out of love. And in the last 5 minutes, they fall back in love. And then if it's a Christmas holiday Hallmark movie, which runs from July to June, they kiss and it snows. The end. They make it look so easy. But it's not that easy. Do you know why it's not that easy? It's not that easy because romantic love has very little elasticity. You try to stretch romantic love and it tends to shatter. Why? Because romantic love tends to be about me. What is she doing for me? But mature love and holy love stretches farther than anyone ever thought it could because it has to. When you've got two sinful and selfish people and they start living together as one, there's going to be trouble unless each of them embrace the higher motivation. What is it? Reverence for God. Do you ever think that maybe God has a higher purpose in matrimony than two people just living together and sharing the same mailbox? Sharing the same kitchen table, sharing the same bedroom? Do you ever think maybe that when it comes to matrimony, it's not your happiness that is most on God's mind, but your holiness? I'm not saying happiness and holiness are mutually exclusive in marriage. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying when you look at your relationship through the lens of God's purpose, you get a whole new perspective on this marriage thing, and you realize it's not about me. So what's the real purpose? What's the real purpose behind this very intense, one-on-one, lifetime relationship? What's the real purpose? The real purpose, ladies and gentlemen, is to draw you closer to the one who brought you together. Think of a triangle, and God is at the apex. He's at the top. And as each one of you grow in your relationship with Him, an odd thing happens. You actually grow closer to each other. That's the way that works. I hope you understand that your relationship with God is going to outlast your relationship with your spouse. Your relationship with your spouse is that long. Your relationship with God is forever. And that's why this is so important. And that's why just working on the symptoms aren't going to do a whole lot. Now, you can try to make your home more peaceful and pleasant, and you should do that. You need to look for ways to keep romance alive. You should do that. You need to be able to, you need to show respect and kindness and courtesy and politeness towards, you should do all of those things. But if your relationship with God isn't what it ought to be, you're throwing Band-Aids on symptoms. Because you'll never be right until you get right with God. Perfecting holiness in your life, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. You see, the problem is we look for something in a human being that ultimately and eternally only God can provide. I think that's why marriage dissatisfaction runs so high, because we expect too much. It's like trying to run today's computer programs on an old 486 computer. Does anybody remember those? The 486 computers? I had one of those. And a few years ago, we went to see my brother in Washington, D.C., and he worked for the FAA near Capitol Hill. And so we were there kind of waiting for him. And we went through one of the Smithsonian museums there, the historical museum. We're just kind of killing some time. So we're going through there and looking at their history of technology. We had Luke with us, teenager, smart aleck. He looked in there and saw my old 486 computer. He said, "Dad, that's your computer." Now, folks, you know you're getting old when your stuff starts showing up in the Smithsonian. You know? Now, in its time, the 486 was a great computer. It was top of the line. It wasn't that it was bad. It wasn't bad at all. And yet, to try to run programs today on that old machine isn't going to work, because you're asking it to do more than it can do. And what I'm saying to you is, maybe we ask more of our marriage and more of our spouse than they actually can do. In other words, if I'm seeking the largest proportion of my life fulfillment and my life satisfaction from my spouse, I'm asking way too much. Because I was created with a craving to have an eternal relationship with God. Your wife isn't God. Your husband isn't God. God's the only one who can scratch the eternal itch in your soul. He's the only one that can do that. When you finally get that basic control module, when you finally get that, then and only then will you have a new appreciation for this person with whom you have embarked upon this very special earthly journey called marriage. Now then, have you ever noticed how often Scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, connects God's relationship with people to marriage? You ever notice how many times He does that? Isaiah 62 in verse 5, as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so God rejoices over you. Matthew 9 in verse 15, Jesus refers to Himself as the bridegroom. In Matthew 22, the kingdom of heaven is compared to a wedding banquet. Revelation 19:7, the wedding of the Lamb, says the bride has made herself ready. And in the Old Testament, the breakdown of spiritual fidelity in Israel is depicted in terms of marital infidelity. Jeremiah 3 and verse 8, I gave Israel her divorce, and I sent her away because she committed adultery. Perhaps no place is the sacredness of marriage seen any better than in Ephesians chapter 5. In Ephesians, the 5th chapter, where holy matrimony is compared to the holy union between Jesus and the church, which happens to be called His bride. In Ephesians 5 and verse 22, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. May I say a word about this idea of submission? It really doesn't start in verse 22. In fact, there's an A part and a B part and a C part. The A part starts in verse 21. And it's interesting, conveniently sometimes we ignore this. Verse 21, be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. He's talking about mutual submission. So I got to ask the question. Verse 21, is marriage included in verse 21 or is marriage exempt from verse 21? Be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. You know, in marriage, there's a principle of mutual submission. There's a lot of areas in life I submit to my wife because she knows a lot more about some things than I do. And so I give way to her. I submit to her judgment in regard to those things, and then she submits to me in regard to some things. There's a mutual submission going on, and that's what verse 21 is talking about. Be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. And then the B part, wives, be subject to your own husbands as to the Lord. And the C part, he explains the B part, verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Have you ever thought about this word submission? Have you ever taken the word submission and broken it down? The word submission is comprised of the prefix sub, which means under. A submarine is an underwater vehicle. The prefix sub means under. So you have under, and then you have the word mission. She is under his mission. That's what that means. So the question then becomes, what is his mission? And his mission is defined in verse 25. He is to love his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. That's the husband's mission. And what wife would not want to be under that kind of mission where a man loves his wife just like Jesus loves us? When a man sacrifices for his wife like Jesus sacrificed for us. When a man serves his wife like Jesus has served us. Jesus is the one who said, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give. And if I'm going to be the godly husband I need to be, then I need to be the Jesus kind of husband I need to be. And I need to serve and I need to give. That's my mission. Sub, under, mission. And it's interesting in the passage. He elaborates on this in verse 28. Husbands, love your wives as you love yourself, as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but he nourishes it and cherishes it. There's the nourishing and cherishing idea of marriage. And he goes on in verse 32 and he says, the mystery is great, but I speak with reference to Christ and the church. I mean, how can you read passages like Ephesians 5 and not come away with a higher appreciation for this relationship called marriage? Go back to 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. I want to look at 2 or 3 verses we don't usually think about in regard to marriage. Look in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 9. Therefore, we also have as our ambition, whether at home or absent, to be pleasing to Him. Is marriage included in that? Or is marriage excluded from that? You see, the first purpose of marriage, beyond sexual expression, beyond the bearing of children, even beyond companionship, is not what most people think it is. They think the first purpose of marriage is so I can be happy. That's not it. God says it's not your happiness. It's mine. To be pleasing to Him. Did Paul not say the same thing in 1 Corinthians 10:31? Whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, whatever covers everything, do all to the glory of God. which is another way of saying the same thing we said in the very beginning in 2 Corinthians 7 verse 1. Perfect holiness out of reverence for God. If that's not enough, let's come down to verse 15. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 15. He died for all so that they who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who died and rose again on their behalf. Again, is marriage exempt from that? Or included in that? God is demanding me and you to look at our lives and the relationship we have with our spouse through His perspective. And He says, your marriage is not about your happiness. Your marriage is not about your glory. Your marriage is about mine. Your marriage is about glorifying me and honoring me and serving me. So my job as a husband is to serve my wife. My job as a husband is to meet her needs. My job as a husband is to put her first. My job as a husband is to sacrifice for her. Because after all, that's what Jesus has done for me. Think about all of that. Now look at verse 18, the same passage. Now all these things are from God who reconciled us to Himself through Christ and gave to us the ministry of reconciliation. Now, Paul is specifically talking in this passage, I think, about the specific commission that Jesus gave the apostles to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, the message of reconciliation. But ladies and gentlemen, is not the work of the church, is not the core of the gospel the ministry of reconciliation? To share the good news that man can be reconciled to God through Jesus' death on the cross. You say, what does that have to do with marriage? Okay. Think about the word reconcile. 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 What's the word that people use when two people can't get along and they decide to get a divorce? What's the common phrase thrown out there? Irreconcilable differences. Instead of reconcile, now it's become irreconcile. What's the point? If our homes are fraught with fighting and animosity and distrust and anger and resentment, then all of a sudden, my marriage contradicts my message. And if my marriage contradicts my message, I've sabotaged the whole goal of my life. Verse 9, the goal of my life is to live pleasing to Jesus and to share the ministry of reconciliation, the message of reconciliation to everybody else. A marriage that is God-honoring puts flesh on the picture of reconciliation. Because a marriage that is God-honoring will model forgiveness and selfless love and sacrifice. What do you think are the very basics of reconciliation? If it's not forgiveness and selfless love and sacrifice. So, what you and I do as husbands and wives, what you and I do for each other, is nothing more than a little taste of what God does for us on a regular basis. Forgiveness, selfless love, and sacrifice. What are you saying? I'm saying your marriage will either be a stumbling block or a stepping stone to the gospel message itself. That's how important this is. Sadly, we live in a society where people just toss their vows aside with discarding regularity. frightening regularity where a couple, they just fail to keep their promises. Or spouse bashing becomes a favorite pastime. But you contrast that to Christians who work really, really hard through the ups and the downs and the rough and the bumpy and all of that to glorify God in their relationship. Those people command attention. Because our lives and our relationships and our marriages become platforms for the gospel of Jesus Christ. How many of you have been married 30 years at least? Raise your hand. If you've been married 30 years, raise your hand. Okay. 40. If you've been married 40 years, raise your hand. 50. Any 50s? 60. 90. Gotcha. I was somewhere doing this. I don't remember where it was. That's 50. There was a guy in the back row. He raised his hand. 50. 60. I kept going. 70. 80. 90. 100. I said, brother, you've been married 100 years? He hollered back. He said, no, but it sure feels like it. And I thought, man, I wouldn't want to be in your car on the way home tonight. Whew. You know, younger people think that folks who've been married 30, 40, 50, 60 years and beyond, that they hadn't had all the stuff that we've had to have and put up with. They don't have it. They had it easier than we do. And that's not true. When people raise their hands that they've been married 30 and 40 and 50 and 60 years and beyond, I'm going to tell you what that is. That is a testimony to the power of God's love and the power of forgiveness and the power of sacrifice and the power of reconciliation, which goes to the very core of what the gospel is all about. I'll leave you with one more thing to think about. When you married, you married a child of God. Which means that your spouse is not just another person out here. Your spouse is God's daughter. Your spouse is God's son. Your spouse is God's child. And you know as well as I do, if you want to get on the good side of parents, then be good to their kids. But if you want to make a parent angry, pick on their child, be a bully, be mean, and you will fire up righteous indignation in a hurry. You don't think it's the same with God? Zechariah 2 and verse 8 says, he who touches you touches the apple of my eye. You married a child of God. So it's not just about me and my attitude toward this other person over here. It's about me and my attitude toward a daughter of God. We talk about sometimes the fatherhood of God. Jesus said, pray this way, our Father who is in heaven. Extend the analogy. Guys, if God is the father of the woman you married, you know what that makes him? He's your father-in-law. Think about that. And when you fail to respect your wife and you mistreat her or speak condescendingly to her, you're going to court trouble with your father-in-law. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7 says that. Show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life so that your prayer will not be hindered. You know, as a father, I pray that my kids will all have spouses who will love them like I do. But as a father, I also know that every one of my children have imperfections and have quirks and limitations because their daddy does. So I would pray that their spouse would be patient with them and be kind to them and be forgiving of them. I would cringe to think they would marry someone who would hurt them, who would be cruel, or who would abuse them. You see, God is fully aware that your spouse has limitations. God is fully aware that your spouse has faults and quirks and sin and all of that. So here's the deal. He wants you to be as forgiving and as patient with their faults as we would want our kids' spouses to be with us. So think about how you treated your spouse this past week. Is that how you would want your son treated by his spouse? Is that how you would want your daughter treated by her spouse? You didn't just marry anybody. You married a child of God. And God watches every day how you treat His precious child. I don't remember the occasion. Luke was the last one left at home, and I think he was probably about 17. And there was some occasion, and he and I went out and played golf that afternoon, and Julie said, you guys go have fun, and then come back. I'm going to have a nice big meal and dessert, and we're going to do it up right. So we went out. We had a great time. We came back. She'd fixed this great meal. It was so good. My wife's a great cook. And she said, now for dessert, she said, I have fixed a chocolate pie. And I looked over there on the counter, and it was one of those chocolate pies that looked fake. I mean, the meringue was whipped up. It was perfect. It would look perfect. And so we cleared away the dishes and went back and sat back down, and she cut me a piece and set it in front of me. Now, you have to understand, my wife's she's big on manners. She's taught me, and she's taught our kids, that when they put something in front of you like that, you wait until the hostess cuts her piece and sits down, and then you eat. Okay. So I'm sitting there looking at this beautiful looking piece of chocolate pie. And she's got her back to me, and I take my fork and I stick the end of the fork in a little bit of the chocolate, put it in my tongue. That doesn't count. And I got to tell you, that was the worst tasting stuff I'd ever put in my mouth. It was horrible. And I realized as soon as I tasted it, there's no sugar in this. This is like bland cocoa. It is bad. She's forgot to put sugar in this thing. So I just put my fork down. I waited. And she cut Luke a piece and set it in front of him. He's a 17-year-old boy. And she says, eat. Y'all go ahead. Go ahead and eat. I watched that 17-year-old boy take a fork. And I almost said something. And I thought, no. This is going to be too good. This is a sermon illustration in the making. I watched that boy take that fork and get a big piece of chocolate pie and stick it in his mouth. And I watched as his cheeks began to go outward and the sweat on his brow. And suddenly there was this chocolate explosion. And Julie's mortified. She's like, whoa, what's wrong? Well, she took a taste. And she, oh, no, I know it. Oh, no. And she grabs my plate. She grabs his plate. And she starts to take it away. And I said, no. Leave it alone. She said, you're not going to eat this. I said, leave it alone. And I looked at Luke. And I said, just do what I do. And I took my fork and I scraped off that perfect meringue. And I got to tell you something. My wife makes the best meringue pie you have ever put in your mouth. What's the point? In marriage, not every day is going to be sweet. It's just not. Life happens, stuff happens, and every day is not going to be sweet. And there's going to be days when you may just have to eat the meringue and like it. That's just the way it works. And that's okay. May God help our homes to be what they ought to be. May God help all of us to take a step back and look into the mirror of His Word and understand how important this is to serve one another in this relationship as Christ has served us. We sing the song of invitation. If you're not a Christian, why don't you obey the gospel and become a child of God? by being baptized for the remission of your sins. Can we help you tonight? Won't you come while we stand and sing?